All right, so we're going to kick it off. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah?
We
Okay.
do half and half.
All right, so welcome to Nothing But the Truth, How Branding Can Help Make Your Museum a More Human-Centered Museum. I'm Eric Longo. I'm Executive Director of MCN. I also teach mobile marketing at NYU and Fordham University and mobile and museums and mobile at Johns Hopkins University. Joining me today, Nancy Proctor, who is currently Executive Director of the MuseWeb Foundation and co-chair of the MW Museum the Web Conference, formerly Director of Digital Experience and Communications at the Baltimore Museum of Art, and from Brazil, Luis Marcelo Mendes, who's an independent branding and communications consultant. So just a little bit of background on how this session came to be and came to life. Luis, together with Anna, I think Anna's in the audience. Where is she hiding? Hi, Anna. Are both co-chairs of the Media Production and Branding SIG, or Special Interest Groups of MCN. And when in the spring, the Metropolitan Museum of Art revealed or launched its rebranding, there was a discussion on the SIG's page, and Luis and I thought, that's probably a good session to have at MCN2016, so here we are. So the way that I thought we would do this today is I'll walk you through a few. I'll start the session by kind of like the concept, laying the framework of like branding 101, and Nancy will follow me and provide some concrete example of museums rebranding and how that affect their engagement strategy and help make their museum more human-centered. And Luis will kind of challenge your thinking by rebranding brand. So to say that we live in a world of brand would be a gross understatement. We are saturated by brands. We interact with them on a daily basis. Everything gets branded: consumer products, concepts, services, cities, movie stars, politicians, especially politicians. And yes, museums. Branding can't be avoided. In fact, it should be embraced. And after all, it's how you tell the story about yourself, and it's at the very heart of all of our outreach efforts, and it drives today business outcomes. So what is branding then? Everyone wants to get attention. Essentially, branding is the art of getting attention. It's how you build your unique identity that leads others to recognize you for your unique traits and features. It's how you tell the story of yourself. A successful brand communicates clearly to its audience. For its intended recipients, that brand resonates, inspires, builds trust and loyalty. A singular brand idea or concept that a brand is a singular idea or concept that you hold inside of your mind's audience. And in this view, a brand can be, it's not something that you make, but it's something that you manage. The most recent wave of brand concept really focuses on brand as an experience. An author that I like very much in marketing is Brian Solis, and it says, experience is the new brand, and experiences are the new branding. On a more conceptual and refined level, a brand promotes the identity and underlying values of a unique culture by communicating the messages, products, and services created by that culture. So it's essentially a container for a customer's complete experience of a product or company or museum or institution. It's not something that you manage, but it's something that you deliver in the moment. So brands are not just about logos, and it's a frequent misconception. However, a logo is often a key visual element of a brand identity. It's essentially its visual representation of a brand idea. It expresses a brand visually. A brand goes well beyond tangible design elements to something more abstract. As an expression of the core values of an organization, a brand creates expectations and makes a promise to its target audience. Then the brand elements when the brand elements of a brand are aligned and it delivers on its promise in a concise way and it tells the story of who you are, that's referred to as, in brand jargon, as a positioning, right? So the way that we think about brands today needs to change. In the past, there were more objects or concepts. You had a relationship with a brand. But in this social age of citizenship, I think brands are relationships. So by defining a brand's particular kind of relationship, a company or a museum can create greater engagement and differentiation and loyalty. A well-crafted brand narrative is one that simply and powerfully tells your story, why it's relevant, and how it meets its social need in a very distinctive way. Good storytelling is about personal relevance. That's why well-articulated museum brands make their stories about people, not organizational beliefs. In other words, the brand is about them, not about the institution. Now we can clearly see how a brand can contribute to making a museum more human-centered. And now, to illustrate that point, I'll let Nancy talk to us and walk us through some museum brand identities.
Sure.
Yeah.
I can just do it this way.
Okay.
Great, thank you, Eric. As always, Eric is in the driver's seat in our relationship. So I'd like to start by saying I think there has not been a more urgent moment than the present for museums to get their heads around and really embrace the importance and the urgency of brand and really thinking through and cultivating your brand identity in a way that serves your mission. And one of the reasons why I say this is a critical moment is essentially if you will, the global generic brand museum is under attack from some very, very prominent, very powerful quarters, such as, for example, Bill Gates, who, as Rob Stein wrote in his essay, Museums, So What?, has been arguing that if you want to do good with your philanthropic dollars, you shouldn't give it to art and museums, but put it towards important causes, like curing world hunger, river blindness, bringing about peace. Absolutely really important causes, no question. But how should museums respond in this kind of an environment where, frankly, its major revenue stream is potentially being diverted away from the institutions. If you haven't yet read Code Words, I highly recommend it. There's actually a second edition out now, but the first book in which this essay appears was edited by Rob Stein, Suze Cairns, and Ed Rodley, and you can find it both online on Medium and order it as a hard copy. So, in thinking about how do we really reposition both our individual institutions and kind of the global concept of museum as a brand, I was very inspired by the work of John Alexander and his colleagues at the New Citizenship Project. This is an organization based in the UK. You might have heard John speak at Museums in the Web earlier this year in LA. And again, recommended reading. A very important document on this kind of body of thought is available for free download called The Citizen Shift. And essentially, the Citizen Shift articulates a movement that John and his colleagues have identified, a change, if you will, an evolution in how the individual is being positioned in society. So if you look back to before the Industrial Revolution, for the most part, human beings, individuals were born into the world, into a certain family, a class, a religion, a community, a nation. and they were subject to those identities which they essentially inherited upon, if not before birth. And they were doing a good job as individuals in society if they successfully and fully played the roles that they had been born into, the roles that had been assigned to them from these external structures. With the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, or arguably a little bit later in the 20th century, we started to have the ability to change our subject position in certain faster, if you will, or more dynamic ways than before, essentially through consumption. So the citizen shift refers to this as consumer society or consumer position, where regardless of where you were born into society, if you have the economic means, you're in a position to buy your way into a different identity, a different role within your society, within your group. So, for example, you can buy an education, you can buy a house in a certain neighborhood, you could buy a different car, you can buy different clothes. And it's very easy for, socialists like me to malign consumer culture and all of that. But I think it's also important to recognize that for many, this has been experienced as a liberation. And one of the great examples that John likes to cite is there was actually a washing machine that came out in the 1960s in Britain, which was called the Liberator. And yeah, you had to have the capital to buy it, but if you could afford it, that was a hell of a liberation for those who were responsible for doing the laundry from the older manual processes. So consumption is certainly not an all bad thing. More recently, however, with the dawn of the internet age, if you will, the social media era, we're seeing an emergent identity for the individual in society, which has been called that of the citizen. So rather than looking simply to construct our identities through consumption, we're actually seeking out experiences and means of participating in the co-creation of an identity along with a larger community. So these are just some of the kind of key words that have been kind of identified as characterizing each of these positions of the individual in society. So, a subject is sort of dependent on a larger social group. Their job is to be dutiful, to obey. They're receiving orders rather than making them. Arguably an iconic medium for communications in this era might be, radio, kind of broadcast medium, such as it has been up until, again, the internet age. In the consumer age, we're looking rather at independence, or at least the illusion thereof, because I can buy. I can choose where I'm going to live, what I'm going to do, and therefore I'm looking for my demands to be met, for my needs to be served. Instead, in the age of the citizen, we're really talking more about interdependence, co-creation, seeking out purpose, community, and platforms on which to facilitate these sorts of interactions. So when I was at the BMA heading up, I originally came on board to set up the BMA's new digital division, and rather unexpectedly ended up also being in charge of marketing, communications, and visitor services. Small museums, we wear a lot of hats. It was wonderful, really. I mean, I've rarely had the luxury of working with such fantastic people and such a great team, and so they more than compensated for my lack of skills in all those areas. But one of the things that we undertook in June of 2015 with the help of the New Citizenship Project and John Alexander was a brand purpose exercise about the BMA. Now, we really needed it. The BMA had not had any brand work done at all since 2002. It had not done, and that was kind of a logo upgrade. It had not done any real branding in the sense of purpose work since 1992. Now, I don't know if you all remember what your world was like in 1992, but I was one of 3 people I knew with an email address back then. It was a very, very different world. So we were in desperate need of an update because essentially our brand was being created organically by every exhibition, every program, every event that we held without any kind of strategy or cohesion or even organized means of getting feedback from our audiences on that. So when John came over to do this exercise, however, we had to kind of limit the range of what we were going to do because we were also in June of 2015 without a director. Our director had retired after 17 years. We were undergoing a director search. We had just finished major renovations of over 60% of the building, and we were about to open a new education center. And what we needed the brand purpose work for most urgently was a way of expressing what this education center was about, its purpose and its role, both within the museum and within the Baltimore community and beyond, to sort of make it stand out from the rest of those components that everybody thought they knew so well, but also from other education centers that had gone before. So John introduced us to kind of a process, which I'll just talk through you here in a sort of a generic sense in the hopes that some of this might be useful for you in your organizations and processes. And he explained to us that brand work is really about purpose at its best. It's not, as Eric was saying, it's not about logos, it's not about visual identity. So, we're asking about why an organization exists, why it was created in the first place, what it has to offer that's unique, and how the meeting of that founding purpose and the current context demand that the organization should behave right now, today. So there's a sort of a dynamic temporal element there. This brand purpose work should result in the organization refreshing its commitment to that purpose, which has always kind of been there, and to do it first through actions rather than logos, graphics, or any other visual identity. And once the purpose is lived, then you can readdress that look and feel, if you will, to draw attention to the change. But let's not have the tail wagging the dog and we start with a logo and then the institution should follow that identity. So the structure of the process was about going through first the why. What is the core belief about the fundamental human need that drives this organization and gave rise to the organization? Why do you exist? Again, it's an existential question that really probably isn't going to change very much over time. The what? What is the unique offer that the organization makes that is the basis of our response to that basic belief in that fundamental human need? That, too, is a relatively static kind of a ground upon which you build. By contrast, the how, the brand purpose, is what drives the organization in terms of how it's acting on that core belief in the current context. So that's what's going to continually evolve. And then you've got your kind of values and behaviors. Those are the ingredients that make up the brand purpose and provide the underpinning to it. So really, again, the why and the what, being relatively static, are something that we rather than conducting a design exercise for, we're conducting more of an archaeological activity to uncover. So this is about going deep into the roots of the organization, its archives, its people, its historical memory, and saying what things have always been there. Those are our core ingredients of the why and the what. The brand purpose then is the key element that will be new, because it's a dynamic expression about what the organization is and should be doing right now in this current context. And it should also enable everyone in the organization to identify how what they do relates to the whole. So how do we create a whole greater than the sum of its parts, and what can we do together to build on that going forward? So this is just a summary of those 3 kind of core questions and how we answered them at the BMA. So our proposed core belief was that everyone, regardless of background, has the capacity and should have the opportunity to benefit from the power of art. And I was reminded of this in an earlier session today when Susan Chun from the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago commented that, we believe that everyone is part of the creative community. And it's such a simple statement, and yet, if that's truly your core belief and you embrace it, it fundamentally changes how you do everything about being a human-centered museum, about being an inclusive practice and organization. In terms of the question of what was our unique offer, what was our what at the BMA, we said we are a globally significant community museum, which was actually an articulation of our chief curator, Jay Fisher, and it was just, again, Jay has been at the BMA for more than 40 years. And so who better than he would know how to answer, what have we got to offer? And it's such a beautiful encapsulation of what seems to be contradictory, community museum, global museum in one. Our proposed brand purpose, the how, was to open up the power of art with the people of Baltimore. So again, this idea of the museum as platform and the co-creation of the institution and its brand with its audience. Once you have a proposed brand purpose, you can then go through an exercise of validation and verification. Is this brand purpose true? It's really important that it feel true to the history, otherwise you're not going to get the staff buy-in and they won't feel empowered or even able to start working with it. But it also needs to have vision, right? So it needs to be a call to action to do more and stretch the ambitions of the organization. And we're going to see that that word ambition is kind of key to this discourse today. And it must give a clear starting point for ideas so that we know where we're departing from. So the question that we articulated to ourselves, how can we open up the power of art with the people of Baltimore at this time, led to those kind of core ideas around the how. And one of the questions that we got from trustees and others was, well, there are lots of other art museums, really good ones even in Baltimore and certainly well beyond. How are we different from them if we're saying our purpose is to open up the power of art with the people of Baltimore? How is that different from any other art museum? And this is where it's important to understand the how as this dynamic thing. How you do it will be unique to your organization, your collection, your people, your programs, your history. So that's where the differentiation comes from. It doesn't come from some external logo design trapping that you can buy and import, which frankly, we all know when you order online, it may or may not fit, right? Instead, it's something that you weave yourself every day organically from those core ingredients, your values, your resources, and your staff. So just to move on to another example, this is another organization that the New Citizenship Project has worked with in the UK, and we conducted an interview with Vicki Harrison, who heads up visitor experience there, about their path on their brand rebranding and brand identity discovery. So York Minster, you may or may not know, is one of the major cathedrals of the world. It's in the top 10 visitor attractions, I think receiving well over 1 million visitors a year in York, England. And it is a complicated place because it is 3 things in one. It is still a fully functioning religious center with millennia-old architecture and history. It is a certified, accredited museum, and it is a visitor attraction. So you can go up York Tower and kind of get big panoramic views of the city and beyond. So when the brand purpose work that they engaged in was undertaken, Vicki sent us these kind of images of kind of how they dealt with communicating these 3 identities and the conflicts and tensions between them and among them in their communications at that time. the fundamental way they dealt with it was with a lot of text, as you can see. So talking a lot around, and almost anxiously, around the concerns that you have money changers in the temple if you're charging for admission to a church, things like that. And having gone through their brand purpose work, they found ways of working more explicitly to their mission, which was articulated as inviting everyone to discover God's love. And so these key words kind of led their brand purpose, inviting, so not just being open or welcoming, a little bit more proactive than that, but neither forcing or pushing. Open to everyone, regardless of whether they're Christian or British or any other denomination. Inviting people to discovery, rather than telling the answers. So this is not a broadcast exercise, but a dynamic one of discovery and questioning. And God's love, and recognizing that that is not only found in kind of the core religious texts and documents of the church, but in much more everyday things, the energy of a team at work together, the beauty of music, the welcome of a stranger, things that everyone, regardless of whether they're Christian or not, could have experienced. And so they work towards the resolution of these tensions among being a church, a museum, and a visitor attraction, between church and business, awe and intimacy, being both an awe-inspiring organization and an intimate experience between religion and personal spirituality, between gravity and humor, and between heritage and innovation. And that last one is perhaps one of the thorniest for them. How do you be a millennia-old organization and yet keep up with the times? So the kind of culmination of this work, and it's not, I should say culmination to date, it's by no means finished, but you can see here this shift, if you will, this citizen shift towards a much more human-centered identity, where those banners have now been replaced with lots of faces of people talking about their experiences, showing their experiences, and inviting others to participate. Similarly, and just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but we spoke with the people at Tate. Now, I have to confess, I am a huge Tate fangirl. I had the great privilege to get to work with Tate back in the early 2000s on their first multimedia and sign language tours, and I've just considered them for so long to be a truly superlative organization with some of the smartest people in our field just doing great work. And so I entered into the interview with their marketing director with a little bit of quizzical, like, what's wrong with the Tate brand? Surely you guys are awesome. And he said, Julie, one of the problems has been that the Tate brand, which was introduced in 2000 with the opening of Tate Modern, has remained very closely tied to that museum. And in fact, there are 4 museums in the group. Tate St. Ives, Tate Britain, and Tate Liverpool, as well as Tate Modern. And so that was one of the kind of imbalances that they are working to address in their latest rebranding work, a way of creating a more equal partnership among and identity among all of those museums. The direction that they're heading, though, I found very interesting, is very much towards resolving that tension by becoming more and more a platform, a space for participation where, again, they're starting to recognize that their brand identity is created by their audiences, by their constituencies, and is not just something that they can manufacture and sell to the public. So this is, again, a work in progress, but I think is going to be a really interesting one to keep an eye on, again, because of the track record and the historic strength of that brand, and just almost presenting the quintessential challenge of how do you shift a museum brand when it has been so very powerful on a global scale for so long. So with that, I will hand over to Luis.
Excellent. Are you ready to rock and roll? Yeah. Are you ready to rock and roll? Yeah. Okay, come on, let's go. So, I was calling this part of the session rebranding branding, but I decided to change. Every session that I've been so far in the conference, since the keynote yesterday, and Christina's, and Linnaeus Bruce, and so many others that are here too. They're all kind of converging to the same talking points that I'm going to present to you today. I'm seeing this kind of level of awareness, this kind of shifting from a unconscious to a conscious level about branding issues, and I feel very excited about it. So if we are in a session called Nothing But the Truth, we have to start with a true sentence, and that is, we don't like the word branding, right? It sucks, it really sucks. It kind of represents everything that we despise from the corporate world. It's something that it's now odd for us. It's something, this idea of getting more people to buy more stuff for a longer period of time doesn't fit our values anymore, especially for us in the cultural sector. And I think we should not be comfortable also with the idea, for instance, for museums, to get more people through the door to see more stuff for a longer period of time too. So that applies to us too. But what matters, and I'm kind of been saying that for a long time, it's not the term branding itself, but the essence of the discipline. It's what make us better museum professionals and help us to get a better service to our audiences. So I have three specific points that I want to address today on how branding can help make your museum a more human-centered museum. And number one is that first lesson to be a human-centered museum from a branding perspective is to understand that your brand is not what you say it is. It's what they say, just what Eric was talking to us about, right? From a visual perspective, if branding is not a logo, from a verbal perspective, branding is not also what you say. It's not what you put on your website or your brochure. Brand, it is more an impression, a gut feeling about something. And culture is changing, and our values are changing, and what the audiences are defining as culture or not, or what it is value or not, it is changing. It is quite different now of what we are used to. And that's what I've been seeing our community talking about in their sessions yesterday and today. For instance, our keynote speaker yesterday, Catherine Bursey, she said, we have to meet them on their own terms. And I know sometimes it is kind of strange to identify a food truck party as culture, but it doesn't matter. If they say it is culture, it is culture. It becomes culture. As museums too, we are comfortable to call this a museum, right? But museums nowadays are what we choose to call them. So this is also a museum, a mobile contemporary art museum. Cute. Also, for instance, in Rio, there's this favela museum, which have no collections at all. It's a museum of stories, of oral traditions. And what about the Palestinian Museum that just opened in the West Bank earlier this year without an exhibition? So if those people there call this a museum, whether there's an exhibition or not, it is a museum. It is a place of identity. It is a place of representation. And so that also applies to this museum, which is so much more than a museum. So that's why Eric mentioned today that you don't create your brand, but you co-create in an experience that matters in that relationship. So, number 2, the second branding lesson on how to be a human-centered museum is to understand that what defines your brand and what defines your institution is not what you say, it's what you do. We have our conflictual relations with brands. We have our conflictual relations with museums. We do. And now we have some conflictual relations with museums brands, and we are putting them to the test. Let's see some examples, like the protests, recent protests at Tate against the sponsorship of BP. There we go. Or British Museum. Or Guggenheim. And what matters here is that trust is the most important asset in a human-centered museum. You can have a brilliant collection, you can have a set of excellent exhibitions, good educational program, wonderful app, website, whatever, but that is not enough, and will never be enough if your audience understands you as associated with a controversial brand like BP, or using unfair label practice to build your franchise in a distant country. That's the thing we have to be aware. Another point of convergence that I've been seeing in those in our sessions here at MCN is that we do understand the need of asking, how has your museum responded to Black Lives Matter? Or how your museum respond to climate change? Or how do your museum respond to migration crisis? The point is, we have to call the end of neutrality. That doesn't apply anymore, doesn't fit anymore. From now on, the relationship between museums and society will take place in this perspective of an individual in a conversation with other individuals. And this is what the co-created brand is all about. So let's take a look at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, for instance. This is a museum that is absolutely consistent with the synthetic idea of bringing people closer to the Dutch art, right? And that can happen in the galleries, sometimes for a single visitor. That can happen in your website when you allow the download of high-resolution images of your collection. Or when you bring this art to the children at the breakfast table. So it's all there. People getting close to the artworks, identification, amazement. You are what you do. And the Rijksmuseum take this idea very seriously, and not by chance. Since the reopening in 2013, it became one of the most valuable brands in the world. Point number 3. So the third lesson from a branding perspective of how to be a human-centered museum is that every change is possible. That applies for any museum and any sort or size. Doesn't matter. It's not a question. It's not an issue of money. It's not an issue of. It's basically about attitude. I have a great admiration for Kim Mitchell. She's Chief Communications Officer at the MoMA. And Anna and I, we made a Google Hangout with her about the new positioning of the MoMA, and it is available on the MC YouTube channel. I recommend you check a look. And one of the greatest things that Kim Mitchell say is her understanding that the work that we do as museum professionals doesn't matter if you're in education, curatorial, marketing, whatever, is the work that every single thing that we do contributes to crafting the brand. And this idea of a manual labor, this craftsmanship, I think it is the kind of branding that applies for us. This idea of everything that you do, in every action that you take, every breath you take, every move you make, it really contributes to that really makes sense for us in the cultural sector. That's the kind of branding that we are looking for. And so MoMA just gave us a brilliant lesson, I think. After a year and a half of discussion, they got to a new ambition, and I loved it. Just the choice to get away from that corporate idea of a mission and a vision that really doesn't apply to us at all, and adopt an ambition of this idea of what drives you as an institution. I think it is great. And MoMA's ambition is quite simple and amazing. So, to be the most engaging museum of modern and contemporary art for everyone. And that's why I think this is a game changer, right? What we're talking about here is the most valuable museum brand in the world, right? And they're not saying, I am the best art museum in the world, I have the best collection, I have the best whatever. They are just trying to point out an ambition, what they want to be. And that's how they want to be relevant and how they want to build relationships. So that's their truth. And finally, I think to be a human-centered museum is to be committed to that truth. The whole truth and nothing but the truth. There we go.
If you don't mind, I'd like to ask the first question.
Oh my God. Here comes trouble.
Taking advantage of this microphone that they unwisely left in front of me. Luis, could you talk a little bit about the difference between an ambition, a mission, and a vision?
Right. Thank you, Nancy.
It wasn't canned, I promise.
No, I mean, we can talk about that for hours, but what I think is when you get rid of that shackles of a understanding that we kind of badly important for the corporate world, like we have to somehow, for instance, let's do a brief exercise here, okay? Thinking about what Gavin told us in his Ignite. How many of you, raise your hands and be true to this, how many of you knows your museum mission by heart? I'm not meaning the interpretation of the mission, I mean the actual mission, word by word. Raise your hands.
2, 3, 4 hands raised. 5.
So
To be fair, the Smithsonian has it easy.
Yeah. So, but that's what we want to achieve. If we got to that level of a real, simple, straightforward, open, and share to everyone in an institution, whatever we want to call it, I think calling it an ambition is a great movement, is a great game changer, because we're getting rid of so many, I don't know, bad vibes or voodoo or whatever, and we're pointing to a place of relationship building. That's what Eric said, that's what Nancy said, that's what we are trying to achieve here as a brand professionals, we're trying to look for relationship building.
What I think also, just to answer your question a little bit more, and then see, for me, an aspiration is where that co-creation aspect comes, because it's a call to action to not just your internal stakeholders, but your external stakeholders. And so you have that kind of like rally cry, which is like to become, to all together, like I forget what to be the most engaging museum for everyone, right? And there was also something from you at the Baltimore Museum of Art. So an aspiration is really a space where brands or institutions can co-create
With the people.
With the people,
Yeah.
exactly.
Any other questions? And do we have a roving mic we should be passing around
think
so
this is the
it can
one.
be recorded? Just so
yeah.
the mic is less for us to hear in this room and more for the recording. So if you, does anybody have a comment or a question or a brand story, confession? Well,
Yeah, I guess.
So I was wondering if you could, I was really intrigued by the idea of like the museum as an individual, and I wonder if you could connect that to like the current situation in the US where corporations have the rights to individuals. And, like, is this a good trend for museums to be mimicking, or should we think of a different way of a museum to be an organization?
so let me just repeat the question. So as I understand it, this is kind of coming out of, from maybe the last presidential campaign, this idea that corporations are individuals. Are we saying that museums are individuals? Is that an appropriate model, or should we be thinking of a different way? I'm not sure we said museums are individuals, but rather that their brands are created by the people who participate in them as a platform. So I think that is structurally quite different from saying corporations should have the same rights as individuals.
Yeah, but then it's that museums are relating to museums, individuals are relating to the museum as an individual.
Yeah.
As if it was.
No, that's right. That's my point. It could be a little radical, I know, but that's what we're here for. But I do believe if we call the end of neutrality, we talk a lot about the museum voice, right? That voice is the kind of thing that we try to do as brand or marketing or communication professionals to get to a certain level of what you can or cannot say, or how you can or cannot say it, right? But I do believe that society will push museums forward to actually have a voice somehow, and positioning itself about all those issues that they need to talk about. Not just a specific museum like a science museum. Of course, a science museum nowadays, has to have a position about climate change. That's not acceptable.
Not to mention evolution.
Exactly. I'm sorry, I forget I'm in the US, but exactly.
I know. Can you believe that's actually an issue here? Yeah.
Right? But it goes forward. It's much more than that. It's not just on specifics that you deal with, but we kind of, get a broader view and a broader positioning in the world to be able to build those kinds of relationships that used to be a more, how can I say, simple game, and now it's becoming quite complex as society is changing, as culture is changing.
There's something about being around Luis that always makes me want to go back to my grad school roots in post-structuralist theory and Lacanianism and everything. I would like to introduce some nuance here. I think An individual is different from a subject position. And here I'm not talking about subject in the way that I was illustrating it from subject to consumer to citizen, but really in that kind of almost psychoanalytic or post-structuralist concept of a subject position, where a subject can have a voice and can have an identity that it is constructed in a discursive practice as part of a community, but that's not the same thing as conflating or confusing institutions and people.
Yeah.
And if you don't mind, also, I put this slide back on the screen because I think this was obviously hacked. It was projected from outside, but I think it's just such a beautiful metaphor for what brand is. It's really a projection of what is in our minds that we slap onto an institution. And this discussion, especially with regards to the debate of neutrality, reminds me of a very recent and still kind of pending incident that I'm sure most of you have heard about at the Contemporary Museum of Art in St. Louis, for example, where a recent exhibition shocked many visitors and staff members, for example, and it's not so much whether it was a subject matter issue or that referred to the obviously very raw sentiments, especially in St. Louis, around the issues of race and social injustice in our country today, but as the seemingly inappropriate response of the museum in engaging its community to respond to what was, inciting such strong emotions around it, and how damaging this is for the brand, right? And I think this kind of illustrates that point perfectly well. So I just wanted to say that.
Sure.
There's somebody in the back. Yeah.
Shelby?
Hey. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Changed its logo, and a lot of people were very upset about it. And I'm just wondering if you have any insight why they would do such
First of all,
We asked ourselves whether we should include that in this panel.
first of all, it was a change in logo. And I'm not sure, it was a much more profound, is there anyone from the Met here? No, Loic is not here.
Nobody who will admit to it, anyway.
Yeah.
They have free sides.
Right. The one thing I would say, though, to you about this is that I spoke to Kirsten Pendergast, I think, at MIA, the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, prior to this session over the summer, and she said, you know what, Eric, she said, if you set out, when you change your logo and you know that whatever you do is going to be misreceived, then it's a success. Because if you change your logo and you rebrand and expect people to like it, it won't happen. However, if you explain to it in such a way, so for example, she when they did their rebrand from MIA to Mia, which is in Spanish or Italian means mine, right? When they first, and I hope I'm paraphrasing Kirsten correctly here, when they first unveiled their new rebrand and their new logo, it was heavily criticized by the press in the Minneapolis area, as should well be expected. And one of the reporters who had mischaracterized the rebrand was invited a couple of days or weeks later to an opening, and all the museum staff wore this T-shirt that says, "Mia is mine." She had a eureka moment, and she's like, I get it, it's brilliant. So it's all about how you position it. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
And having a story, I think one of the things, the points you made, a brand is the story of you. And if you have a coherent story, even if people don't like the look and feel, aesthetic tastes differ, that's different than just an empty visual change.
It'll be authentic, people trust it.
There are 2 points, interesting points in the Met rebranding. First is a practical reason. They needed to do that. I mean, in order to accommodate they were dealing with 3 sites, So there's a brand architecture issue they have to address anyway. From a practical side, it was necessary. The other interesting point about it was, for the first time that I know in history ever, we had a brand repositioning, a rebranding that got into a global discussion instantly. That's the thing that since then only applied to the corporate world. Like Gap changed its brand, so everyone's talking about at the same time in the world. But now a museum brand, rebranding is to be the point of discussion globally, and people taking sides if they like it or not. That's new, and that's new, and we have to be aware of that. There was in the Communicating the Museum conference in Berlin, forgot his name, Chris from Tate, Chris Dirkon, maybe. So he had this. He said something that I was quite impressed. He said, "We have to be aware that eventually our brands will become bigger than our institutions," and that's Tate. And he's so right. I mean, if for instance, we all know that Coca-Cola as a brand is way more valuable to the sum of all their actual assets. So we'll be there, we will come to a time when some museum brand will be more valuable than the collection itself. That's something to discuss.
Yes.
Going back to the conversation about whether the museum is an individual, I mean, it's not an individual, but it's an entity. It's not a collective, it's a collective entity. So you broke trust, not like, an individual person who works here broke trust. You, the institution, broke trust. So each institution has a personality, and that's part of the brand, intentional or not. It has a personality, it has a perception. And so if you're going to rebrand, that means you're going to basically present to the world, we want you to have now a different perception of us because we have a different perception of ourselves. And that is a dialogue that may or may not go well.
Right.
But you have to be aware of that sense of we are somebody.
Yeah, sure.
That's really nice. I'm going to just restate that because I want to make sure that gets recorded. And correct me if I've got this wrong at all. So an institution may not be an individual, but it does have an identity. And to say we're going through a rebrand says we want to change your perception of us as an organization because our perception of ourselves has changed. And that's a conversation that may or may not go well. Right. I love that. Thank you.
Funny fact, thank you for the question. Funny fact is, if we do understand a brand as in that level of a gut feeling about something, sometimes we do refer to institutions as an individual. Like we're talking, that museum is an asshole, for instance. Like, we refer to them on those terms, like we kind of, although it doesn't make sense in a rational perspective, but as a gut feeling, we do refer to them as individuals. We do that from time to time.
One last question.
Offer some advice for an institution that maybe the graphic designer is leading the charge for the like, how can we sort of redirect the conversation to make it less about fonts and color changes and more back to us as a whole?
I was just thinking, I'm sorry, could you tell us your name, gentleman sitting next to you? You just said that brilliant thing. Shelby Marshall, what he just said about, it's basically saying our perception of ourselves has changed, so we want your perception of us to change too. I was thinking, what a brilliant way to start a rebranding conversation inside the institution by saying, okay, why are we doing a rebranding? It must be because our perception of our brand, of ourselves, of our story has changed. So, given that, let's enumerate the ways that it has changed. And that move right there seems to me is going to set the whole process off on a very different foot. And just reminding again, this is not about going shopping for a new outfit, which may or may not fit you. It's about an archaeology, a rediscovery of self, and how that self has evolved over time, but nonetheless is still coming from some common roots and origins.
Can we also unpack the part, Shelby, that you talked about the conversation may or may not go well? Because I think that is also at the heart of the question of it's easier to kind of focus on the fonts and those kind of things than the conversation both internally as people in the museum talking about branding and then your conversation with your visitors. And I'm not quite sure, I'm still trying to unpack.
Yeah, shopping is easier than undergoing analysis, right?
Right.
Thank you.